Welcome to the State of Education with Melvin Adams. I am Melvin Adams, your host. My guest today is Andrew Glover, a parent from Lynchburg, Virginia. At Noah Webster Educational Foundation, we believe that parents are the first educators and should always have a primary influence on the education of their children. So, we're always happy to talk to parents who have something to share. Andrew, welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, let's just jump right in here. First of all, please share a little bit about yourself and why, as a parent, you've chosen to attend school board meetings and make your voice heard.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have three boys, a 7-year-old, or an 8-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, and a 16-month-old. My journey into kind of the more administrative school board end of things started right around the time that COVID hit. I saw when they shut down schools, at the time my two oldest boys were attending an elementary school in the system, and they weren't doing anything. The take-home material that they had sent was not being graded. It was haphazard, and it was a mess. And I initially went to the school board trying to get them to move and be like, okay, we need something different than essentially coloring sheets, which is what it felt like at times. Mm-hmm. And so I went to the school board and I was given 3 minutes, and that was it. And they didn't say anything else. They didn't acknowledge the problems. They didn't offer any solutions. No response. And so I went back to them again, and I'm like, okay, we need to work on opening schools. What's the plan to get us to where we can have a safe school environment, so where we can send our students who are at home filling out sheets that you're not even grading? How do we get them back in the schools? Given another 3 minutes, not a word from them. And so it went on like that for about 3 months. And finally, I said enough's enough. And so I got a group of other parents who are having very similar problems together. And we went as a group. And again, no change from the school board. So what initially started as let's get schools open, then transferred the following year to, okay, now, because that was 2019, then 2020 comes. That was 2020, then 2021 comes. The school was still shut down at the beginning of the 2021 school year. You're still working remote. It was slightly better, but then I started seeing what's in the curriculum. And so our group got together and we started addressing the things that we're finding in the curriculum as wrong. And so it just escalated. And now we've got a group of around 400 parents that advocate for our kids in the school system here.
Wow, that's excellent. I think we have a video clip of you addressing the school board. Let's take a look at that.
All right.
Our next speaker will be Mr. Andrew Glover, who is going to talk to us about school policy and curriculum, representing conservative parents of Lynchburg. Welcome, Mr. Glover.
Thank you. Good evening, Lynchburg City School Board. My name is Andrew Glover, and tonight I represent the conservative parents of Lynchburg, a group that has grown to almost 400 concerned parents, caregivers, and teachers in Lynchburg City. First off, I want to acknowledge that today was the first time that students have been able to be mask-free in schools. And I am excited that teachers and staff got to see their students' faces for the first time in 2 years. It saddens me that it took the entire state legislature and the governor to compel you to support parents. One area of concern that is still out of compliance is in regard to the nature of divisive material still being taught and or paid for by Lynchburg City Schools, which is a direct violation of Executive Order Number 1, recently substantiated by the rescinding of the Ed Equity program by the Department of Education. Despite clear direction that you were given by law and by policy, LCS is still seeking to spend an additional $26,000 to pay the University of Lynchburg to teach these types of topics. For instance, in a textbook for LCS course number 6339AD, the textbook reads, quote, "The ideologies of meritocracy, equal opportunity, and individualism that we described above play a powerful role in denying and insisting that society is just. That author later states, white identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside of a system of white supremacy. Now, unfortunately, our concerns are beyond just this one class. But even in foundational classes like freshman literature, where multiple classes just last month were assigned to read, discuss, and report on a book that promotes anti-police views, as well as perpetuate the message that racism is everywhere and white people are responsible for fixing this problem. Your desire to push this divisive narrative is evidently so powerful that you are okay with using a book despite its substantially inappropriate language, which includes 46 uses of the derivative of and the literally substantive
Glover, we will not use,
37.
Mr. Glover, we will
I
not
can
use.
keep on going, and this is in the book. If I can't say it in a school board meeting, they shouldn't be reading in a book. I'll go on.
Thank you, sir, but no profanity.
This is in a book that is being used in a freshman literature class. It's no wonder that you are seeing this behavior in. This book is a book that is being used in a freshman literature class. It is no wonder that you are seeing behavior issues in class if this type of literature is being held up as a standard bearer for LCS. Several months ago, our group members shared a list of books that we were concerned about. In total, that book list had 127 books, and to date, we have not heard back from one of you regarding that list. It is this type of leadership that that is contributing to the reason why half of our students are still below grade level. Later tonight, you will look at mid-year academic reviews for the LCS school system. On the surface, elementary schools saw fantastic progress compared to the last update we received in August. However, 49% of third graders, 63% of fourth graders, and 68% of fifth graders are still showing below grade level. More concerning is the trend in high school, which indicate that our high school students are losing ground, not gaining it back. At the beginning of the year, 41% of high schoolers were behind in reading, and now that number has grown to 46. And board docs did not provide that information for math, and I hope a school board member will ask for the math information. Finally, I would not be remiss to mention that the overall concern regarding recent bullying behaviors and attacks are escalating in schools. I share the concerns of many that have already spoken, as well as a press conference from a group that we're not related to, but share 3 or 4 other specific instances of bullying and attacks and stuff. We need to know that our children are safe when we send them to our school. So to end, I'd like to quote that book that I spoke of earlier, When I Tell You, You All, and I quote, strap on a pair and get together. Page 76. Which will require you to stop fighting parents and start working with us. Thank you. It's in your textbooks.
Mr. Glover, thank you. And I must state to any speaker who approaches the Lynchburg City School Board going forward that in terms of literary dialogue, that is one dynamic. But there will be no tolerance for profanity or vulgar language shared during the public comment section.
Thank you for becoming engaged and for going and speaking to your school board about your concerns, and also to rally other parents who could come and speak and really address these issues because of their concern for their children. That's so important, and we're seeing more and more of that across the country. Certainly we support that as long as it's done respectfully, which it seemed that you were doing. So thank you for that. Let's dig in just a little bit. You were talking about some of the books and some of the curriculum. It certainly has made a lot of news across the country with the stuff that people are realizing is in the curriculum of our schools, and our students are seeing this sometimes very, very young. So here's the question. What is your take on let's say, book banning or restricting certain books in our schools and public libraries?
I think we need to be careful on what it is that we're defining. We're talking about banning books from the public education system and from public schools. These are students, they're minors, they're youth. We're not talking about restricting free speech, trying to burn books and prevent them from ever coming to market or any of that. We're talking about controlling what it is that our children have access to.
Mm-hmm.
And just because something is in a book does not mean that that book is right, and it does not mean that the theory that is presented in that book is right. And just because someone took the time to write it down on paper does not mean that that theory is therefore validated, or that we as a society have to validate that theory. There's a lot of bad theory out there, and I'm sorry, we don't need to. We do need to be in control of what it is that we're exposing our children to, and doing it in a thoughtful and a methodical and a right way to do that.
So you said a thoughtful, methodical, and right way to do that. What are some of the ideas you had?
I'm a Christian, so everything that I do through my worldview as a Christian. And the Bible is very clear throughout the entire scripture that we are called to take our thoughts captive, is that where our thoughts are, where our energy is, that's what ends up expelling out of us, and that's what we end up becoming. And so the very first thing to do is we need to just be okay with saying, no, these certain things are not acceptable, even in tiny, small amounts. So the book I was talking about in that video, it was actually referenced two separate books. One was a critical race theory book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, and basically saying, and the premise that all whites, by the nature of your skin color, makes you racist, or not racist because you're black or white. Why are we even entertaining that? Why? Just because the book might have other good thoughts or ideas about the nuances of racism, doesn't mean that we need to validate the author or even let that little bit creep in and take a foothold in our education system. Mm-hmm. So that's really the first way to be thoughtful, is to really kind of take control of what it is that we're ingesting. We're seeing a lot in Disney right now. My wife and I are currently having discussions on whether we cancel Disney. Do we stop paying for our Disney Plus subscription? And we're having very serious thoughts about that, because it's not that the majority of what it is that they're presenting is right or wrong. It's the fact that little by little, those little pieces are taking bigger and bigger steps. So let's just take control of our thoughts right now. I think the next thing is just not normalizing bad behavior. And a lot of these books, because they want to push an agenda, they normalize other bad behavior. So the second book that I quote from is a book called All American Boys. And it pushes the idea that police are bad. It's got major anti-police views. It pushes the fact that racism is white people's fault, and it's white people's responsibility to fix it. And so those are the two prevailing theories that the public education system, supported by a lot of institutions, is wanting to push. And as a result, they do so at the expense of other bad behavior. That book normalizes underage drinking. That book has massive amounts of profanity. And you normalize this behavior to where you have a freshman book, a book you're taking. These kids are just out of middle school. They're younger kids. You're not talking a senior or a college student. You're talking a freshman high schooler. And you're telling them this is the behavior that this book normalizes this bad behavior. Mm-hmm. Well, now no wonder that we're having bad behavior in schools when we're holding up books that literally have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of instances of bad behavior.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I've often said we are what we think, and we typically think as we are taught. Yeah. And what you just said is a classic example of that. We're taught certain things, we read certain things, whatever goes in gets processed, and it just starts to come out. as you said. And well, that's so true. And that is why it matters what our kids are taught. I mean, there's just no question about that. You mentioned that you're a Christian. Not everybody in the system would
Sure.
would profess that. So, how do you propose navigating reading material that reflects positions of various faith communities?
I think that this gets into a question of morality, largely. So, our morals are essentially our guiding beliefs and standards of the way that we live our lives. And that's the definition of morals. Everyone, regardless of whether they're a Christian or not, they can be agnostic, they can be atheist, they are all guided by a set of morals.
Right.
And our morals can only come from one of three locations. They can come from ourselves, in which case, whatever I decide is morally okay, is okay, and similarly is not. But that means that basically I'm anything I want. If I decide personally that murder is okay, then murder is okay under that instance. So that can't be. So the second place is that, well, society can set morals. And I think a lot of people land on this concept that they're not related with a religious text. And well, society, by the laws that we set, says that these things are permissible and these things are not. But the problem with society setting morals is that society is oftentimes wrong. It falls victim to groupthink. You look at, the atrocities of World War II, and where German society at the time said it's okay to kill this whole classification of individuals, in this case the Jews. And society deemed that okay within the German society. And so our society can't be that set of morals either. So ultimately, you're left with, you can continue to exist as society, and therefore society would be the school board, and the school board gets to decide these things. Or you can go back to the basics of the morals need to be an unchanging, which requires a religious text. In this case, for my belief system, that's the Bible. What you'll find is the Bible, the Quran, all of the other religious texts, they all have basically the same moral principles. There are some deviation, but 80 to 90% of your moral principles are the same regardless of what the religion is.
Right.
And being careful of what you ingest and training your children up in the way they should go is universal across all religions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It is true that almost all the world religions have, very, very common core sets of moral values. There, like you said, there are some variances of, really more pertaining to certainly the character and nature of God, and how that reflects on our personal identity and, how we see ourselves and we see the world. But in general, in our relationship to ourselves and to others around us, that communal fiber that kind of creates that social moral structure, we will find that almost all world religions are very, very close there. So
Yeah.
I think that's an important point to make. And if it passes muster in the major religions, you're saying then you're okay with that?
I'm going to be okay with it just because I'm a firm believer. I think that there's just precedent in other places to support that outside of my own belief systems.
Okay.
I just have a problem with society saying, well, I choose to believe this is correct or I choose to believe this is wrong, because society shifts back and forth so much that your morals change and morality can change. And therefore, what is determined right as wrong can change. And I just don't think that right and wrong should be changing at all.
Right. And I think you hit on an important point here. There is a difference between a person's personal, we may call them convictions, or their standards of morality. That varies widely versus what are considered as universal standards of moral behavior, which are much more defined. And so, yeah. All right. So as a parent, What do you think constitutes good reading material for school libraries, and why?
I think that you need to get to what is the point, what is the intent of that reading material. First off, is what is it that we're doing? That's the first barrier. Are we promoting something that is generally positively good? So are we promoting critical thinking? Are we promoting mathematics skills or English literature skills? Are we promoting being a good citizen? So that's your first level, is the overall intent of the book positive? There's some books that just don't even hit that basic thing. There's a lot of them that I'm thinking of, like Genderqueer or Lawn Boy or some of these other ones that I would just say the intent is specifically to promote immoral or bad things that we just don't need to address in a school setting. They're personal choices. They're things that should be controlled by the family and by the parents, and that shouldn't be coming from the public education system. So why are those in our public schools to begin with?
Mm-hmm.
A parent needs to be addressing, and a parent needs to be invested in the children's lives. You don't want to, and unfortunately you see it a lot, the school is not the parent. We are the parents, and we need to be the ones responsible for some of these gray area matters, especially when it comes to sex, when it comes to certain cases of racism and responsibilities therein of. There are just certain things that are the responsibility of the parents and not the responsibility of the school. So what is the intent of that book? Is it to replace the parents? Or is it to continue teaching, reading, writing, arithmetic? So that's your first thing. I think that the second thing is, how is the material presented? Is it presented in a way that tells and outlines a good story? We can tell moral and good stories without normalizing bad behavior. There are always, always, always alternatives to telling moral stories and telling things one way, and to be able to get a point across without bringing in bad behavior. I'll use an example. One of my absolute favorite book series is a book series called Jumper by Stephen Gould. That's about it. I don't know if you've read it, and it's a novel about this guy who in high school learns that he can teleport. And the way that he learns he can teleport is through escaping a abusive relationship within his family. So his father regularly beats him, is regularly abusive to him. And the way that early on that is presented in a very kind of just, yes, there's abuse. It reinforces that the abuse is bad, and generally does an okay job explaining that. But then later on, under this new discovery phase, the main character Davy has essentially is an attempted rape, and this one chapter in this book that introduces the whole series is completely unnecessary to the story. And it's like, why is this in there? Yes, it reinforces the concept that trauma is what caused him to escape, and in escaping, that's where your teleportation comes in here. But you've already established that. What was the point of this whole section? It was just unnecessary. And so it's like, how can I recommend something as one of my favorite series when it has something that is just unnecessary and is unfortunately really graphic? And it makes to where I can't recommend that book until you're old enough, and I would say an adult, even though this is targeted towards preteens.
Mm-hmm. I would argue that, first of all, let me say this. I agree with your premise there and your recommendations, but I would argue that the whole matter of whether or not books are, or anything even beyond that, is appropriate in our schools really goes back to what is the purpose of education. What is education? What is its purpose? What are the purposes of our schools? And if we go back to the founding father of American education, who was Noah Webster, who this organization is named after. I mean, in his dictionary, the definition that he had for education was this: to bring up as of a child, instruction, formation of manners. Education comprehends all that series of instruction and discipline which is intended to enlighten the understanding, correct the temper, and form the manners and habits of youth and fit them for usefulness in their future stations. To give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable, and an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties. So, first of all, I think from that we see that his idea was that it was the first responsibility of parents and guardians to do the educating, but he also showed they basically broke down what the real purpose of education was, and that is to impart knowledge, to develop character, and to equip students for a useful place in society.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
I think that that's a really solid definition. And so one of my concerns is that, and this goes back to the discussion we had on morality, is that who determines what character is worth developing? And that's where parents need to be involved in the school system, and understanding that there are other alternatives to the public education system. First off is that we do have alternative educations. It's not just stuck in the public school. Now, there's certainly parents who don't have a choice, like single income families, maybe non-nuclear families, low income families, like they're just stuck in the system. But just because they're stuck in the system doesn't mean they can attend school boards, be active in the schools. But then there's others. There's homeschoolers, there's private schoolers, there's online schools. There's hybrids where it's a combination of a private and a homeschool, and that's becoming really popular recently. Mm-hmm. And it's just being involved in, and as a parent, making sure that your children having access to the positive character that you want developed in your children. And you're not going to be able to do that if you're not involved in whatever schooling system you choose to be in.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question for you. Maybe I'll couple of them here together. So as a parent activist, I'm going to call you that. That's how you might be viewed. What resources and support do you wish you had? And where should a parent begin if they are frustrated by their school and their school's curriculum and they want to get involved?
Yeah, so let me start with the second part of that, and then we'll go back up. Is if anybody wants to get involved, understand that it is a marathon, not a sprint. Right. Showing up at a single school board meeting or showing up at a single event is not getting involved. Getting involved means showing up at your parent-teacher conference, sending weekly emails to your teachers saying, how can I help my student? Showing activity outside of the school boardroom so that you have a relationship with that teacher and the teacher knows, hey, I want to be your partner in this because my child's education is important. From there, it is absolutely instrumental to be present at the school board meetings so that when you raise a concern that the school board doesn't ignore you. Early on, without a group, it just felt like we're just being ignored. So get involved and here in the local Central Virginia region, we have fantastic groups. We have the one that I lead in Lynchburg, but we also have a different group. There's a different group in Bedford, and there's a different group in Amherst, and there's a different group in Appomattox and Bedford, and all of these locations. Campbell also has a new one. Get involved in those groups because you're going to be able to keep eyes on a lot more things. And you can delegate certain tasks. We have one parent in our group that's just solely focused on tracking books. We have another parent that was tracking the mask updates on the legislative level. We had another that was just all these different issues. There's just too many to approach on your own. So by getting involved in a group and bringing, others into this or joining a group, you can watch these things and also invest into it as saying this is the things that we need to come together and really be vocal at the school board meetings on, so that you can show that you're not just talking and parroting some news line, but that what you're saying is based on informative information that you're seeing truly in the schools versus what you're just hearing about on the news.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I would say how parents get involved is that they need to do it, and it needs to be, unfortunately, it's a full-time job, but so is parenting, and it's the most important job you're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of resources, there's certain things that I wish that I struggled with at first that I wish I had more help on. Things like understanding Robert's Rules of Order so that I understood what was and wasn't permissible in a school system. Very early on, the school board, using procedural grounds, were essentially bullying people and preventing people from speaking, using just obscure things. So understanding the importance of looking through the established rules and policies and understanding and identifying, these are where I'm allowed to speak, here's where I'm not, here's the important things, here's not, how to read an agenda, and just kind of the training of understanding how a school board meeting happens.
Mm-hmm.
So I luckily came into it, and I had previous exposure to parliamentarian rules and stuff like that. So I didn't come out of it from the cold, but a lot of parents really are. And I think that would be one really helpful thing, because school board meetings are boring. 95% of school board meetings are absurdly boring.
Yeah.
But that 5% you have to stick through because that 5% matters. Being able to be on top of your game and having a centralized resources for the agenda so that you understand what it is that the school board is going to be talking about, so that you can approach your school board members ahead of that agenda and be able to advocate even before you say your first word. If you haven't talked to a school board member before that meeting, you've already lost. Mm-hmm. So having a resource to be able to identify when are the meetings across the board, because every county is different. And unfortunately, it's just there's kind of learning the rules and the way to go about it has been a learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's excellent. Andrew, thank you for joining us today. It's been very insightful what you've shared with us, and I'm sure many of our listeners are going to listen closely, and they're going to have some takeaways that they can take and apply into their own circumstances. Thank you. I appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Now, to our listeners, if you found encouragement or insight in today's episode of The State of Education, please hit that like button and subscribe. And we look forward to sharing more quality content thanks to our generous support from our donors.